So we are working on 1997 Honda Civic LX 4-door with the 1.6 liter D16 Y7, and we are doing a full JDM engine swap for a D16A. This engine swap is due to the fact that the D16Y7 original motor was overheated without coolant and needs to be replaced. Could have done a whole engine rebuild, but it was actually cheaper to just do an engine swap. So over here, we've got the old motor. There's our block stamp, D16Y7. This is the non-Vtec motor. As you can see in the top here, we've got some plug wires that melted themselves into the spark plug holes from overheating. So the biggest first step of getting the engine out is going to be undoing your harness, which is going to be a lot of electrical connections. One of the things we did, obviously, to make this easier is we took the hood off. Makes it obviously much easier to get the engine out itself. So we started pulling electrical cables. There's not a lot of necessity to keep track of what goes to what. Most things will run out their length to the plug they go to. As well, there are no identical plugs on these cars. So you won't run into like, I wonder if it's this plug, I wonder if it's that plug. All these plugs are unique and only plug into one specific item, aside from things like the injector plugs, which will tell you which one goes to which one by its length. One of the other things we did is we didn't actually remove the AC compressor. This would have required draining the AC system and refilling it. So instead, we just detached it from the front of the engine, which it mounts over on the driver's side of the engine, right there, against this plate right here. So we removed the AC compressor, we pulled it up out of the engine and set it to the side there. Once you get the electrical connections out, you're going to pull the harness from driver's side over to passenger side, where the harness comes into the engine bay. You need to undo things like your fuel rail banjo bolt. You are going to find yourself not able to hoist this engine from a lifting point, much like the Accord engines actually have a lifting hook on them to lift the engines out. These Civic motors do not. We simply wrapped the hoist cable around the area between the oil pan and the transmission, and then again around the far side of the engine block below the alternator, and brought it up and hooked the cable and just lifted it out. So we also removed the power steering pump. That's something we're going to be switching over to the new engine, and it was generally in the way. Come prepared with a lot of towels, rags, shop towels to clean up all the fluids that are going to come out. Big first steps to make it easier are drain coolant, drain oil, drain transmission fluid, drain power steering fluid. That will significantly reduce the mess that's created. You're going to want to undo the strut towers, undo the main mounting bolt down below so you can get some play on your hub, and I undid the upper control arm from two 14mm bolts, one there, and identical on the driver's side. This allowed me to spring down the hub and the brake assembly, and allowed me to move this around enough to get the axle out from inside of it without having to remove the axles from the transmission. The downside to this was when we brought the engine down with the axle still in, the driver's side axle being longer got caught under the engine as we set it down and ripped itself out. So we ended up having to get a new axle. The passenger one seems to have come out fine. Once you get axles loose and hanging, once you get electrical undone and pulled, fuel undone, all your vacuum lines, and again with the vacuum lines, generally they're not going to be able to go into the wrong place. They run to where they need to go, and they're different sizes of fittings. You're going to start working on engine mounts. At this point, you either want to block the engine on the bottom so you have support, or get your hoist hooked up so you're ready to carry that load as you undo the engine mounts. We've got one wishbone mount at the back of the engine right here, and that mounts to that right there. We attempted to remove this from the 3-bolt side, so there's 2 bolts there and 1 bolt there. It was just much easier to take it out with a single bolt on the back. and that's a 17 millimeter. Then we came over to the transmission mount side. There's supposed to be a transmission mount right here that goes inside of this. We ended up taking this out, and as we tried to hoist it, the mount that goes here itself got in the way of the engine, so we just took it off. That's it right there. As well, there's a mount on the front of the transmission that goes on right here. That guy is right there. See the 3-bolt pattern. And that's 3 mounts so far. On the driver's side, we have the standard Honda driver's side upper mount, single bolt here, 2 nuts that go on the spike studs right here, 1 and 2. We undid that, and then on the lower side, down below the AC compressor, there is the last mount. That is this guy on that plate. It's going to be way easier to just take this whole plate off. It's got 4 bolts, 14 millimeter I believe. So we just undid the bushing from the frame side and took these out. This bushing was actually shot. We needed to get a new one. This is the old one. Obviously, there's no mount in there. So we ended up getting a new mount. This is a good time to examine all your engine mounts. Here is the transmission mount, still in good condition. Examining this engine mount on this side. It doesn't have a lot of play. It's pretty stiff, so it's decent. Same thing with this guy back here. Just check them all out. While they're already out, you might as well replace any that are damaged or worn. And for this swap, we had to swap over the intake manifold. So here's the new JDM engine, the D16A from Hmotors Online. Hmotors Online is a great place to get engines. They have a wide selection. They're fairly quick on their delivery, approximately 14 to 21 days in peak ordering, which is now during the summer in the Pacific Northwest. So it took me about 21 days to get it due to the shipping address. I had to transfer 3 different carriers to actually get delivered to me. So that was a bit obnoxious, but had I been actually living in a main city, it would have taken about 19 days or less. So here's the transmission. We undid the bell housing. One thing to recognize for the bell housing is the starter actually needs to come out because this lower starter bolt actually goes all the way through the transmission into the engine block. As well, something I didn't know was going to happen, the shroud that goes on the lower part of the transmission to cover the flywheel, little thin metal piece, it needs to be unbolted as well because it's actually bolted to the engine and the transmission. So once we got those unhooked and undid all the bell housing bolts, whole transmission came out. Good time to inspect the clutch. If you already got it open, you might as well do a clutch. This engine actually had an extremely heat-worn clutch that was subjected to a lot of heat fatigue and a lot of cracking, so we replaced it anyways. Other things we had to transfer over, the distributor, the alternator, the power steering pump, as I said, the intake, and then the last thing for this Japanese engine that the USDM has, Japanese doesn't, is the crank position sensor. Actually, this guy right here runs down into the crank. So we need to swap that over because this engine doesn't actually come with one. It comes with a fitting for it, like it has all the bolt-up positions, and we need to have a crank position sensor. It's also a good time to do a quick oil filter swap. If you already got it out, it's pretty easy. Back here is your PCV valve housing, the positive crank ventilation valve. This is also a good time to replace that if it's not in good condition. An easy way to check PCVs if they're in good condition. Let me grab my new one. One of these guys. When you shake them, you can hear a little clip inside go back and forth. If you shake your used one and you don't hear anything moving back and forth, you can either try cleaning them. Generally it's easier just to get a new one. They're about $2 to $3. This is a Duralast from AutoZone. Pretty simple and straightforward to put on. Much easier to do with the engine already removed. And that pretty much does it. You lift the engine out after getting the mounts out. The only thing I missed so far is the shift linkages. We left the shift linkage hooked up to the transmission, pretty easy to do. There's also the suspension shift linkage that bolts into the transmission as well. We undid that. This was way easier than trying to undo them from the transmission. We just took them out with it. And then everything just goes in reverse order. Don't forget your fluids, coolant, oil. You're going to have a little bit of a slow start when it starts, as you've relieved all the pressure from the fuel line and allowed a lot of air to enter. So give it a few good cranks, foot to the floor to kind of get the oil flowing, or not the oil, the fuel flowing. And that pretty much wraps it up.